Thanks so much, Liz and Michelle. It's a pleasure to see you all. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Sam Levy. I'm Senior Counsel at Everytown for Gun Safety. We're the nation's largest gun violence prevention organization. My work as part of the law and policy team at Everytown really focuses on the development and passage and implementation of gun violence prevention policies that's at the state and federal and local level. My work in particular focuses on state legislative work, and mostly in the Northeast region, which is where I focus my efforts and also where I'm located. Before I joined Everytown, I was a prosecutor at the New York County DA's office for about 10 years, and I've been with Everytown since 2016, and I've had a chance to work on obviously a lot of exciting and interesting state legislative work and policies to prevent gun violence that we'll talk some about today. I do want to leave ample time for discussion and questions. I think I'm going to try to move through some of the higher level discussion items first. I'll take some pauses. If folks have questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat, and then at the end we'll leave as much time as I can for Q&A. But I think overall what I want to cover today is sort of a very 30,000-foot view of what are the state of federal gun laws and state legislation, how those laws evolved over time. What's the interplay of those laws? How do they interact? And what opportunities do they afford, to address the epidemic of gun violence, to think of it as a public health problem, to create a range of solutions that are aimed at reducing gun deaths and injuries and protecting communities from the trauma that arise from those incidents. And then again, hopefully helping to set the stage a little bit for not just the legislative context, but heading into the really community-focused work that you all will hear about at the fourth session next time. So with that, let me talk a little bit about federal law. So, as broader context, there's sort of two general bodies of laws that are applicable at any time, anywhere in the country, right? One is the federal law, which is applicable to all 50 states and US territories. And then there are state laws that are, applicable and enforceable only within the boundaries of the state by state law enforcement. One of the important distinctions there is when you have a federal statute, the folks who are responsible for enforcing it are federal law enforcement agents, right? So that's ATF, FBI, Department of Justice as your prosecutors. State laws, on the other hand, are enforced by state officials, right? So state and local police departments, sheriffs, county and state's attorneys, attorneys general. That's an important distinction because while the federal laws are foundational, and we'll talk about what they cover and what they don't, the vast majority of sort of enforcement of gun laws and practical day-to-day use of gun laws are at the state level, right? These crimes are, mathematically speaking, far more often enforced, at the state and local level than they are by federal counterparts. So first, sort of a historical backdrop of the most notable pieces of federal legislation. Obviously, there's tons of things that we could cover here, but I want to try to give everyone sort of an understanding of how the landscape has evolved and how it feeds into the story of what states have done and can continue to do, in the legislative space. So the earliest sort of national legislation on the issue of firearms was the National Firearms Act. It was passed in 1934, largely in response to, the kinds of horrific crimes associated with sort of gangland violence of that era. It was targeted at a very specific subset of particularly dangerous firearms that were common in those types of crimes. So that's, machine guns, Tommy guns and short barreled rifles and shotguns, a very small subset of firearms that, as I said, were sort of used commonly in those gangland crimes. And the federal government used essentially its taxation authority at that point to impose new restrictions on the sale and possession of those weapons. So you had to apply for and obtain a tax stamp from the federal government, which required a background check and a payment of a fee, and those weapons had to be registered, before they could be sold in the U.S. And many of those restrictions are still in place. Those types of weapons are generally prohibited. Machine guns, of course, again outside of that special registration in limited circumstances. Again, before that, there was very little in terms of federal regulation on who could buy and sell and possess guns, right? There was a time when you could buy guns in like the Sears catalog, like that sort of thing you could send away, and whether it was going down the street to buy one at the gun store or shipping it from across the country, there was very little regulation of any kind, before you get into these types of federal laws that started in the early 20th century. The next and most sort of broadest change after that was the Gun Control Act of 1968, which again was passed in response to the string of assassinations of President Kennedy, of Bobby Kennedy, and of course Dr. King, and that imposed a whole new set of restrictions on the industry itself. The people who are in the business of manufacturing and importing and selling firearms, and also put regulations in place on who could possess firearms, right? So those broad federal prohibitors that you think about of, convicted felons, people with histories of acute mental illness, fugitives, things of that nature. And so that class of prohibitions has grown over time. Over the years, for example, prohibitions were added for people who have been convicted of certain types of domestic abuse crimes, right? So misdemeanor offenses that wouldn't otherwise prohibit you from having guns do prohibit you if the victim of that crime is your spouse or a family member, because again, what was learned over the years of the intersection between domestic violence and firearms, federal law was amended to prohibit those people as well. And again, all those industry regulations were new at the time. They exist to this day. Record keeping requirements, rules for reporting when firearms are lost and stolen. All these things are laid on top of federal regulation, which really does focus largely on the industry and on licensed sellers. So if you want to sell guns anywhere in this country as a profession, you have to have a license to do so. It's called being a federal firearms licensee. The ATF issues a whole range of different kinds of licenses. There's importers, there are manufacturers, there are people who are collectors of antiques and curios, collectors items, sort of firearms. There's a whole range of licenses, and you can't legally engage in the business of selling guns in this country without being federally licensed. Many states, of course, as we'll talk about, also lay state licensing on top of that. But that's sort of the federal baseline, and being a federal licensee carries with it a whole host of obligations, including not selling firearms, of course, to people who are legally prohibited from having them. Then the next sort of historically moving forward through time was the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, obviously passed on the heels of the attempt on the life of President Reagan, and that created sort of what we know today as the modern day background check system, which is the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, and that created and mandated the use of a national database for all licensees, which has to be consulted before you sell a firearm to anyone. That includes handguns, rifles, shotguns, any kind of firearm. Federal licensees are barred from selling any of those weapons unless and until they initiate a check through that National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which again, of course, is designed to prevent sales to people who are legally prohibited from having guns before they happen. And again, that system has been tweaked and adjusted. There was the Knicks Improvement Act of 2008, which was a measure aimed basically at improving the NICS system, the National Background Check System. The way that system works is it's basically a collection of relevant records, right? So when you have prohibitors at the federal or state level, for example, for somebody who's convicted of a felony, when a person is convicted, that court record has to actually be transmitted into the system for it to be of use, right? If you run the check and no one knows that you've got that conviction, there's no record establishing that fact, then the system can't function. So, the Knicks Improvement Act was basically aimed at doing the work of ensuring that all the records that are relevant to that system, so that could be criminal records, right, for convictions, that could be family court records for, orders of protection or other prohibiting events, mental health records for folks who are involuntarily committed and become prohibited for that reason. All of those things that, the system only works if those records are reported and accessible. And so that's been some of the work over the years of strengthening that federal system. And that is really, I guess, is purely 30,000 feet, but it's helpful to sort of lay the groundwork. But that is sort of that's the foundational work of, how guns are bought and sold through licensed dealers, what the prohibitions are for who can possess them and who can purchase them. And of course, a whole host of rules on being in the actual business of importing and manufacturing, imprinting serial numbers, record keeping requirements, how long you have to retain records. All those things are laid out in federal law for federal licensees. And as I said, some states, go above and beyond and layer on top of that. Also worth noting, a handful of limiting laws at the federal level, right? Those are sort of the foundational laws of, who can possess a firearm, how it's, what's a legal sale versus an illegal sale. But there have been laws passed over the years at the federal level that are actually sort of antithetical to the goal of this public health approach and to understanding the problem of gun violence. And I thought it was worth naming them briefly for folks' awareness. So one of them is what's known as the T-Hart Amendment. And it was sort of an amendment to a budget item many years ago that basically said, so one of the things that ATF does with all the records that are kept is that if a gun is used to commit a crime, for example, and recovered, it's stamped with a serial number by its manufacturer. That gun can then be reported into Knicks, and they can trace that firearm, right? They can look that number up. It'll identify who the manufacturer was. They can call the manufacturer. The manufacturer in turn can tell them who the wholesaler was. The wholesaler can in turn tell them the retail dealer to whom it was shipped. And the retail dealer is obliged to keep records of his transaction. So they can then use the number and actually find identify the last lawful sale of that gun, in the hopes, again, of tracing how it got from the gun store to a crime scene, to develop leads and hopefully combat, the trafficking in firearms. The T-Hart Amendment basically restricted the use of that tracing data. Like, the information about where these guns are coming from is extremely valuable, both from obviously for law enforcement as it's used, but also for developing a public health understanding of, like, what does gun trafficking in America look like? Like, who are the sources of these crime guns? What are the patterns? Where are the places that we should be focusing efforts of law enforcement and elsewhere to make sure that guns aren't being diverted from the legal market into the illegal market? And that amendment really dramatically restricts that, and so it makes that work extremely hard to do. And unless and until it's lifted at the federal level, it's an impediment to that kind of understanding of the scope of the gun trafficking problem. Another one is the Dickey Amendment, another sort of budgetary amendment that was passed a number of years ago, and basically says, in somewhat vague terms, but in terms that are chilling enough, that it's basically shut the door on research. So none of the funds that the federal government provides to the CDC or the NIH, right, the two organizations who are responsible for understanding, public health crises and epidemics and the like. It literally just says none of the funds made available to them may be used to advocate or promote gun control. That's the whole sentence. What that means is sort of anyone's guess. Obviously, the premise was to scare folks away from things that the industry thought might, chill the market or have some other adverse effect. People, and I think the upshot has been that researchers and others who could be spending time and effort on understanding the scope of this problem from a public health perspective have been fearful of doing so, for fear of running afoul of this and ending up getting their funding cut or their department penalized. So another, a huge sort of barrier at the federal level to one of the things that's vitally important to this work, which is research to understand the scope of the problem and actually craft solutions that can address it. And the last one, which is again of huge import at the moment, is PLACA, which is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. That was a law passed early in the second Bush administration, George W., which was basically an industry protection. It's a statute that says at the federal level, gun industry members, so that's gun manufacturers, wholesalers, importers, retail dealers, cannot be sued in civil court or held liable for damages resulting from the illegal use of their products, right? So if somebody commits a crime with a gun, a mass shooting or other act of gun violence, this federal law basically gave blanket immunity to the industry from victims, their families, survivors, from bringing those people as parties into the lawsuit, with limited exceptions. This kind of blanket immunity really doesn't exist anywhere in America. Any other consumer good that either by design is dangerous or can end up being, costing people their lives or being used in dangerous ways. So I'm thinking of tobacco, opioids, the automotive industry, right? Things that are inherently dangerous or can be dangerous as used, all are not only subject to a ton of federal regulation that frankly doesn't exist for guns, but also are subject to liability for when their products hurt people. But since PLACA was passed, the gun industry has basically been absolved from that sort of liability, and as such has had very little incentive to adopt best practices or make their products safer as a technical matter, and incorporating new technologies, and also it's as I said, it's sort of this unique giveaway to the industry that doesn't exist for any other industry at the level. So at the federal level, so it has stymied that kind of work. There's work going on in the states that we can talk about it a little longer at the end to sort of work around that law. But again, it's a sort of unique protection that has made it very difficult for folks who are actually harmed as a result of gun violence tragedies to seek redress in civil court. So, that's the very high level on the federal stuff, and I want to sort of contextualize it and pivot into the states by thinking very broadly about what's covered and what's not, right? So when you talk about things like the background check system and federal prohibitors, that background check requirement is only imposed on licensees, right? So people who are licensed under federal law to sell firearms, right? People who are in the business of selling guns. It does not apply to private citizens who are not in that business, who happen to have guns and may sell many of them, places like Arms List and other sort of websites, or go to a gun show and set up a stand, or post an ad in their local paper saying, guns for sale. There are thresholds in federal law for what it means to be in the business that are wonky and very difficult to summarize in brief, but in short order, the background check requirement, federally speaking, doesn't apply to those kind of unlicensed sales. So one of the major things that can be done and that many states have worked to address is ensuring that all gun sales are subject to a background check, right? There's no time a gun should be changing hands without confirming before the sale that the person that's receiving that gun is not, prohibited under state or federal law from having it, isn't a domestic abuser subject to a restraining order, any of those things. Like, that's a really fundamental safeguard. It's a thing that I think everyone agrees upon in principle. Obviously getting changed at the federal level on that is tricky, but it's something the states have done with great success. And it's also worth noting that there's a lot of ways to implement that kind of a background check system, right? The Knicks system is a point of sale system. It takes a snapshot in time and says, on the morning you walked into the gun shop and contacted Knicks, we checked all the relevant records and there's nothing prohibiting here. But some states go farther than that and actually implement the background check more robustly with what we refer to as purchase permits or licenses to possess firearms, which actually requires you, before going into the gun store and picking out your gun, to obtain a license to purchase that gun from some state authority, whether it's state police or a licensing authority in the state. And what that does is actually give the authorities a chance to do not just those sort of paper checks to make sure you're not a prohibited person, but also consider the applicant, right? Consider, is this a person that is known to law enforcement because they've made threats against people in the community? They've been, people have responded to their home, even though there's never been charges or convictions for any crime for conduct that clearly indicates that the person is at risk. Is the person, you think about, tragedies like Buffalo, is the person, posting hateful content online? Are they vocalizing threats about, how they're going to use this gun? So again, those kinds of systems we think of as sort of a more robust background check system that allow for a little bit more fulsome understanding of who the recipient would be, and hopefully afford law enforcement officials the opportunity to prevent that sale before it happens. And then, with all the prohibitions and sale requirements at the federal level, one of the things that's not present is removal of firearms, right? So even if you become a prohibited person, again, it's a snapshot in time. So you could buy guns for 5 or 10 years, have a prohibiting event, becoming a felon or domestic incident, whatever it might be. Those guns are now illegally in your possession, right? And so that what the federal law doesn't provide for is a process to ensure that those illegal guns are actually removed from these situations, so they're not used to do any harm. And that's a process that, again, the states have stepped up with great success to do in many places where, not only are states, and again, this is partially comes back to the question of who's enforcing the laws, right? So you have many state laws that look a lot like the federal prohibitors, where state law says, we prohibit felons, domestic abusers, whoever it may be. Those are state level prohibitors. In enforcing those prohibitors, a lot of states have gone further and said, look, if you have one of these prohibiting events, the court's going to instruct you, that you're not prohibited from having guns under state law. Here's the process for surrendering those firearms, any licenses you might have, that sort of thing. So processes that allow for, again, sort of a going forward understanding of not just, making sure gun sales are tracked to make sure they're not being sold to prohibited people, but making sure that if people become prohibited either temporarily or permanently, they don't have access to guns. Again, really, access prevention is the heart of this story, right? I mean, the issue is access to firearms by people who shouldn't have them, people who are a danger to themselves and others, children, again, things like responsible storage, which are a tremendously important issue, is not something that federal law addresses, right? There is no federal law on that. It's up to the states to say, look, this is what it means to securely store a firearm in a way that's going to prevent unauthorized access, whether it's by children or an otherwise unauthorized person, to prevent a whole range of harms. And that obviously covers, self-harm and firearm suicide, and again, other tragedies like school shootings where children gain access to firearms in their home or relatives' homes that aren't properly secured. And so the work that that we do in the states and that our federal team works is obviously sort of in conjunction, of course, but a lot of the work at the state level is understanding what can be done, trying to understand the scope of the problem in your state, right? Many states like yours, the problem is very much a problem of self-harm and suicide, right? In states that have larger cities, it's everyday gun violence, right? Where you have concentrations of handgun violence, often driven by gun trafficking, illegal guns, and everything in between, right? There's a whole host of, this is an extremely multifaceted problem, right? As with anything else, like there are issues that undergird gun violence, right? That lead to economic and housing and a whole host, mental health, a whole range of issues that intersect with this, right? That are a root cause of a great many of these issues. And so creating a really robust sort of policy approach that requires a huge range of different types of interventions, right? There's no one law at the state or federal level that's magically going to solve anything. It really is the hard work of unpacking the problem, understanding it, identifying where a community can benefit most, right? Where the hardest work is, and how to understand the range of options that can be brought to bear, and then seeing that those solutions are really implemented fairly, rolled out, relied upon, understood. I work a lot. I live in New York. I worked on that state's extreme risk law. In the wake of the Buffalo shooting, there were many questions asked about, well, why? There was a known threat to the school. There was all this other stuff going on. Why on earth didn't someone seek one of these orders? And the truth is, like, these laws are only effective if they can be implemented, right, and understood, right? To have everyone we've done a number of trainings for groups here in New York, for law enforcement and school administrators and others, to help them understand what the law is and how it works. That's just as important as passing the laws themselves, right? And understanding, making sure that people know how to avail themselves of these things is really a vitally important part of the story. And again, I think that's sort of a very high level overlay. I think as we, the other work that we try to do is to think in new ways, right? Think in new ways of how to approach the problem. So, when we deal with something like the PLACA law, for example, the story does not end with, these individual acts of gun violence perpetrated by, whoever the suspects are, right? This is a problem that if you really want to solve it, you have to go look upstream, right? All these illegal guns start their lives as legal guns sold by a manufacturer, a wholesaler, or a dealer. And some of those dealers are just bad actors, right? They're engaging in practices that are making it possible to traffic these firearms. They're ending up with guns being trafficked illegally across state lines and ending up at crime scenes. And so a really holistic approach has to hold the industry to account. And so places like, again, New York sort of has passed legislation to try to work around that sort of PLACA shield at the federal level, to make sure that when there is misconduct by the industry, and again, the vast majority of dealers abide by all the restrictions of the laws. They don't want to be giving guns to gun traffickers or to straw purchasers. The vast majority of these folks are good faith and law abiding, but the issue is when you have folks who are not, they're disproportionately fueling a massive problem. And if there isn't a concerted effort to identify those folks and hold them to account, it becomes impossible to sort of address the issue at scale. So I want to pause there for some questions. We talked about a ton of stuff. We only have an hour. And again, I'm happy to talk more about the range of what we think of as the state level policy solutions, what you all think of as the pressing issues that you're solving for, and what I think might help. But I want to leave plenty of space for questions and comments before I take up too much more of our time.
I had a question.
Yes, go ahead, Brian.
Go ahead. Yeah, I was wondering, and I'm sure this varies from place to place, what percentage of homicides are done using an illegal gun versus a legal one?
So it's not a stat I have top of mind. I mean, I think in the case of, you know, gun violence in cities, it's very often traffic guns, you know, illegal guns or guns that have been, you know, handled through straw purchasers or stolen. Stolen guns are actually a huge and growing problem across the country. Gun thefts from cars, for example, are rising at just a staggering rate. So it is a great many. I think at the point of the commission of the crime, they may well be possessed illegally. But as I said, you know, there's a number of steps you can take going back in time to ensure that legal guns don't turn into illegal guns, right? Through loss or theft, or through, you know, a straw purchase or trafficking that are all really important.
Yeah, Liz has her hand up. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I wondered, Sam, if you were familiar with the kinds of steps being proposed in Congress and the Senate negotiations now to strengthen background checks. I'm told they're really marginal improvements.
You know, I think there's a lot of things under discussion, right? There are ways that you could strengthen, for example, that definition that I mentioned of being engaged in the business of guns does a lot of work, right? I mean, there's ways that you could adjust that to actually reach a much larger scope of transactions, including the ones that take place, you know, online and places like Arms List and you know, these other platforms where you have, you know, unlicensed sales that are able to be done without a background check. You know, there's questions about improving, you know, I mentioned the federal prohibition on domestic abusers, right? But there's a loophole in that law that's known as the boyfriend loophole, right? That it's the definition of federal law applies to basically spouses or people who are similarly situated, right? Someone with whom you have a child in common, someone with whom you reside. It misses a wide swath of intimate partners, right? If you don't cohabitate, if you don't have a child together, that's something I hope they're discussing. You know, I think other issues like, we didn't even talk about the Charleston loophole, right? So the background check requirement requires, if you're a federal dealer, that you initiate the check. It doesn't require that the check actually be completed. As long as you initiate the check and wait for 3 business days, it's up to the dealer's discretion at that point, barring some other state law, if they want to consummate the sale. So even if after 3 days, so if when you ping the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, most of these checks are done within a matter of minutes, and they'll give you an answer that says, yes, proceed, no, this person's prohibited, or basically think of it like a stoplight. Like red is stop, this is a prohibited person, green is go, you're all clear, and yellow is please wait, right? We have some record here or some information that we need to do more digging about before we give you an answer. So that might be a conviction from a local court that isn't clear, you know, for a misdemeanor assault, for example. If it's not clear from the record whether the victim of that assault was a wife or a spouse versus a stranger or a coworker, that's the difference between a prohibiting conviction and a non-prohibiting conviction. So the Knicks system might say to the gun store, please wait, you know, we have to get some more information. If after 3 business days they don't hear back, federal law says you don't have to wait. If you, the dealer, want to go ahead and sell the gun, you're welcome to do that because, you know, the check is taking longer than 3 days. That yields a not small number every year of sales that get finalized, and then ATF and their agents have to go out and remove a gun from a person who they later realize was prohibited, and the sale should never have gone through. So that's a loophole that again can be addressed. There's, you know, things like the T-Hart Amendment and all the rest, like, are all really foundational. I don't, you know, this Congress is not one that is known for you know, robust bipartisanship and deal making in this space. It's a very difficult issue. Everything seems these days, I'm sorry to say, to be a little difficult in Congress, but you know, our hope, look, I hope that you get something done. I hope it's meaningful. I think anything getting done is a big deal, right? In this time when sort of gridlock seems to be the word of the day, but that's just some of the stuff that may be under discussion. And again, I think it'll depend what the appetite is from you know, the Republican members primarily, who are 10 of whom are going to have to sign off on whatever can get done.
You said in the 1930s that the law that their machine guns were outlawed. And could that, I don't know how that happened, but could that be applied to AR-15s somehow?
Well, yeah. So, for example, there was, as you may know, there was a federal prohibition on assault weapons for about 10 years. It ran from 1994 until the law was sunset in 2004, and that law was aimed at that sort of weapon. When you hear AR-15 is basically it's a shorthand. It's a manufacturer's name for basically a type of semi-automatic rifle that. Again, because of its physical characteristics, is just extremely lethal, right? It fires rounds with incredible force, and when coupled with things like high capacity magazines, are able to produce just mass casualty and mass fatality incidents in horrifically short amounts of time. So when you look at the largest mass casualty shootings, places like Las Vegas and Parkland, most recently Uvalde and Buffalo, like those weapons are weapons of choice for in those circumstances. So the federal law existed, it was impactful, but it was sunset. And again, I don't foresee in this Congress necessarily or an appetite to revive that. But we work at the state level all the time on bills that are aimed at either restricting or prohibiting some class of those weapons, right? So many states do still have their own assault weapons bans, like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, a range of others. Many states have high capacity magazine prohibitions separate from the type of firearm. And so those state laws are really important, right? Of course, there's still the problem of, guns are available in other states and guns can cross state lines. But we continue to fight for those laws and strengthening those laws. New York just the other day strengthened its high capacity magazine law, which has been on the books for many years, but they were having a hard time enforcing. So that work's really, really important too. So there is work to be done at the state level, not just in the form of prohibitions, but one of the other things New York did with respect to those sort of semi-automatic rifles was to pull them into their more robust background check system. So that if you do want to buy one of those extremely lethal guns, it basically gets treated the way New York currently treats handguns, which is that you have to have a permit to purchase it, and you have to go through that process of, again, with the investigation to make sure that there's no other sort of concerns or flags or prohibiting details that should stop the sale.
Okay.
Lenore has her hand up for a question.
Yeah, Sam, I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question.
Sure.
And it was just your mention of the boyfriend loophole made me think of this. So I think a lot of people sometimes don't pay attention to things until they impact their community or their state. And we did have a couple of weeks ago here in Iowa, we had a really tragic homicide that kind of exposed the boyfriend loophole. So I've had a lot of people in the last few weeks asking me what that was. I think just because, it was a couple of students, female students at Iowa State who were murdered by one of the women's former dating partners. So I think when things happen in people's communities or states, they sort of pay more attention or take notice. And I've had some people say to me, I never really understood what the boyfriend loophole was until that happened. But my question is a completely different one, and it really has to do with law enforcement, and probably will expose my lack of knowledge of how law enforcement works. But our neighbor to the south, Missouri, I believe it was the past legislative session, passed some legislation that somehow let state and local law enforcement off the hook or prevented them from cooperating with federal law enforcement. And there's a word for those kinds of laws, but I can't remember what it was. So
Nullification.
That's it. Thank you. I knew it started with an N. Can you talk about those laws, sort of where they're at in court in terms of like if they're going to be found constitutional or not, and the impact that those have on gun violence in the state in which they're enacted?
Sure. So zooming out a little bit, so what Lenore was mentioning is what we term broadly as sort of nullification laws. So what's inherent in what I spent the first few minutes describing, which is basically this constellation of federal laws plus this constellation of state laws, is some degree, at least in my mind, of a sense that there has to be some cooperation between the states and the federal government if those laws are to be sort of robustly and effectively implemented. And that's taking place, all over the country. There are partnerships between state and local law enforcement agencies and ATF and the Joint Terrorism Task Force and a whole bunch of work that is not just important for collaboration, because as I said, guns travel across state lines. There are incidents and patterns that a state or local police department might be seeing that are tied back to something that ATF or FBI is investigating across the country. So there's already tremendous and really effective partnership going on across the country between local and federal law enforcement. It's also a source of a lot of really important funding for state and local law enforcement agencies. Are those types of partnerships that bring with them the sort of access to not just federal knowledge and support, but also literally just monetary resources to sort of build out those sort of partnerships. What you've seen over the last several years are attempts by state legislatures to sort of end that understanding, right? They depict this as sort of like some of them, I'm speaking now of the outermost, most extreme version of these bills, any federal law or pronouncement that infringes upon anyone's right to possess or have guns is null and void. It is of no meaning within the four corners of state X. It shall not be recognized. No state or local official or resource or any time shall be allocated to assisting in any way or recognizing in any way in its enforcement. And in the most extreme version, actually tries to bar federal authorities from enforcing federal law within that state. Now that is where you get into the ground of, in our view, and I think in courts' views that have analyzed it, those are clearly unconstitutional, right? The state doesn't have the power to unilaterally say, federal law just simply doesn't apply here, and federal agents who take an oath to enforce federal law are barred from doing so in our state. As you get into more, what you generally see are things that are not quite that extreme. Missouri's is actually quite out near the periphery. Other states do things that are a little more circumspect, right? Where they say, look, you do what you want to do, FBI and DOJ, if you happen to be in whatever, New Hampshire, pick a state, but we're not gonna spend any of our time and money on it again. And it's sort of this, some of it is a bit theatrical, right? It's sort of like a chance to say, gun laws are overreach and tyrannical and all the rest. But it has real world impact. I think even if all you say, and even if it survives a challenge, is that we're prohibiting our state and local officials from participating, that has a lot of ramifications, right? Never mind investigations into things like gun trafficking and illegal possession that are coming out of state, but what happens when the federal government calls to run a background check and calls the county, the state clerk at the criminal court to say, hey, can you tell me about this case? Like, are they prohibited? That's a federal law that requires the background check. Are you going to not answer the phone and say, yes, he did assault his wife and now he's a prohibited person? Like, that's really important stuff. And it's, the laws are new enough that I can't say what the upshot has been, but I think the danger is very real, which is like, if someone can't thinks that these laws tie their hands for reporting records into Knicks databases, right, or answering the phone for a background check, or again, even assisting, with an urgent call about a terrorism or domestic terrorism investigation by ATF or DOJ, there's going to be real public safety harms there at some point. So in my humble estimation, like the best case scenario is, fulsome cooperation and partnership between the states and the federal government. But obviously that's not always a view that counterparts share.
Well, if nobody else is going to talk, I have something else I want to ask you. And I just heard about this last week, and it seems like it would be something that if we were to address, it would be a federal, it would be in the federal purview rather than the states. And I heard a piece about how many weapons, how many firearms are being sent illegally to our neighbors to the south, to Mexico and to Central America, and how that is a source of gun violence in those countries as well. So, we're sending guns down there, and then, of course, then their citizens are fleeing gun violence in their own communities by trying to come to the United States. Is anybody paying any attention to that? What could Congress or someone do about trying to sort of tighten that up? I know the flow of guns and drugs is, it's a pretty porous border, but is anybody talking about that as a problem that we should be addressing at the federal level?
I think so. I mean, it's not a thing that I'm deeply conversant on. I mean, there have been lawsuits brought, maybe it was A.G. Healy in Massachusetts, I forget, but like suits brought basically attempts by foreign governments, right, by Mexico specifically, to say, look, these are all coming from from up north, and there doesn't seem to be any work being done to actually stem the flow of these weapons. But yeah, I mean, again, and it's really part of the broader industry accountability story, right? Which is like the, for an industry that obviously is profit driven, right? The more guns they sell, the more money they're making. Like there has to be more to the story than that, and there just simply hasn't been to date. So I think it's a thing that's thought about, and then that there's space to be worked on, but not something that I'm deeply expert in.
I have,
Yes.
it was my understanding that a few years ago, the Johnson County Sheriff could say that could deny a license to anyone who was accused of domestic violence. Then the governor stopped that from becoming allowable. She wanted every county in the state to have the same rules. And I guess Johnson County was peculiar in that way, that we did have that rule. So I guess it would have to be the governor's decision as to whether or not a single county can do what it wants to do in terms of background check.
Yeah, so that's another good question. And so, we talked about the federal and the state interplay. There's a separate level too, which is, again, statewide laws versus local laws, right? There are town councils and city councils across the country that have the authority to do a lot of work in a lot of states. I think it depends on, in the first instance, on what's known as preemption. So some states have laws on the books that literally define what powers are given to localities in this space, right? Many states have passed preemption laws that say, it is the intent of the legislature that we be the sole arbiters of all things firearm related, right? So sales, possession, carry, transfer, taxation, a whole range of things. And if that's the case, the localities will actually really be limited, right? Their hands will effectively be tied. Some states do the opposite and say nothing, whatever our state laws are on the books, nothing's stopping you localities from doing something stronger, right? And so you see that in even a place like New York, where there's a really strong background check requirement and a purchase permit for handguns, but not rifles and shotguns. But New York City requires it for everything. You can't buy or possess a rifle or shotgun of any kind in New York City without a permit to do so. So it can swing both ways. But it's an analysis that requires looking at the state law, looking at what it is the local legislative or governing authority is trying to do, and figuring out whether they have the latitude to do it.
Okay. To pursue the state. Wish.
My thoughts exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Liz has her hand up. Do you want to go ahead and make a comment or question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. What is the law about ammunition, federal restrictions on the sale of ammunition, including high capacity magazines and all that? Is it the same as for weapons, or is it different, or what?
So ammunition is not regulated the way that weapons are. The laws apply to firearms as that term is defined. As I said, there had been a federal prohibition on high capacity magazines during the 1994 assault weapons bill that has since lapsed. So again, there's no federal prohibition in place on any size magazine. So you see, these the semi-automatic rifles are often sold with 30 round magazines, are pretty standard. Places like Las Vegas, you would see these huge 100 round drums that are generally legal and saleable in most states. I think it's 8 or 9 states have state laws in effect that prohibit high capacity magazines, with slightly different numbers. 10 is the most common. Some of the more recent laws are a little different. It'll be 10 for Vermont is, for example, 10 for rifles and shotguns, but 15 for handguns. But yeah, those are not things that exist at the federal level at this moment. And before any other questions, I do want to just try to pivot a little bit to what I know you all are going to be talking about next time, which is, so a lot of the work in this space, laws matter. Gun laws work. They help keep people safe. I'm happy to share. I'm going to drop in the chat a link. I know a couple of links are in there already, but we at Everytown have tracked a wide range of gun law policies. And as you look at them state by state, you'll see that the states that have the most robust protections in place have the lowest incidence of gun violence. And that includes, suicides and homicides and the rest. They're all really important. And I'm going to, that's how I spend my day. I'm proud of the work that we've done and to help partner with the states to pass these good, strong laws. But a lot of the work really is, and has to be community centered, right? And community focused, right? The laws matter and they work, and we want to keep making them stronger. But a lot of the heavy work, whether it's, suicide prevention and self-harm, preventing everyday violence in large cities where it's so rampant, really require a whole other host of interventions and engagements, right? So for self-harm, that could look like, educations around crisis intervention and prevention, approaches to prevent access, even in states where you don't have things like an extreme risk law for, out of home storage, temporary removal, things like that, how to secure your firearms in the first instance, right? Responsible storage. You don't have to have a state law for that, right? Everytown and Moms Demand do a lot of work, through Be Smart and other sort of purely educational programs of like, this is why secure storage matters, right? And this is how you do it. And this is the potential consequences if you don't. That stuff's vitally important. And then a really robust range of community-centered work, right? Programs, and I think a lot of our work in the cities where everyday gun violence is most, is most acute, is really working on innovative ways to sort of break the cycle, right? To understand how, again, from the public health approach, that violence is very much spreads like a disease, right? There's violence and retributive violence, and there are ways to interrupt that cycle, right? And try to intervene that, again, don't have to be rooted in state law. Sometimes the fight is to get just money to support those kinds of programs, which we do a lot of and have done to great success, but crafting solutions that are center and really acknowledge the identity and the experience of the people who are living through it, right? Which looks very different across states and across the country, that leverages, credible messengers who can go and take that work out into the communities to try to interrupt these cycles of violence, are really, really vital to the work too. And that's something I'm sure you'll hear more about next time. And that we're very proud of the work that we've been able to do to help sort of uplift and partner with some of those the local groups doing all kinds of work of many different stripes all across the country.
Sam, do you want to talk about the research specifically on the impact of strict gun laws and reduced violence? Is there anything that you want to say about the most effective strategies that states have used?
Again, I think you'll see, I encourage folks to check out sort of the rankings page. You'll see the litany of policies we talk about. It's very hard to disaggregate, like, this is the one law that had the greatest effect. Again, like the dearth of research owing to sort of the federal funding limitations, and just the complexity of trying to unpack, states with laws A, B, and C versus states with A and B. It's very, very tricky, but we have, again, our researchers are fantastic, and the sort of academic peer-reviewed stuff that we rely on to try to identify what's working. And again, I think you'll see the correlation is real, and it's a matter of, again, identifying the problem you're solving for, right? Is it a self-harm suicide problem? Is it a everyday gun violence in cities problem? Is it a trafficking? Is it a child access problem? Like, we know what tools we have in the toolbox. I think it's a matter of trying to understand the problem in a way that's fulsome, and really tailoring the solutions, again, that have to be multiplicitous, even for a single problem or two, in ways that are going to be most effective for the state or the community that you're trying to protect.
All right.
Lenore, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have my hand up again. I just want to amplify what Sam said about the quality of the work. So I hope everybody looks at that, the study that they did on the rankings of the states, and you can go up in the upper right-hand corner and you can explore by the particular state or by the particular policy. And they looked at like 50 different policies, which are sort of groupings of individual state laws. So it's really a rich resource, and I still haven't explored it all. But Sam, I wanted to ask one more thing. If you're aware of what the current funding situation is for research, because I think that we all noticed even when we were preparing for this course, trying to look at, what are evidence-based solutions. I think because of the Dickey Amendment, it was really hard for people to look at that. So Everytown's done this really good work. Plus, it seems like since Uvalde and Buffalo, there's been an explosion in the press about what are evidence-based solutions. So there was a thing in a big article, front page article in the New York Times on Sunday. We sent out a very recent article, a link to a very recent article from the Washington Post. So it seems to me like more people are paying attention to looking at what are the steps that really make a difference. And do you know anything about the kind of funding that the CDC might be getting or the NIH might be getting to do that? My impression is that's loosening up.
Well, again, I think the language in the Dickey Amendment is somewhat vague. I don't foresee, again, people may be a little more courageous in this moment at CDC or NIH to try to test the waters. But the truth is, like, the Dickey Amendment doesn't bind private academia, right? I mean, you've got scores and scores of really brilliant researchers at places like Hopkins and Stanford and across the country, all doing, again, I should preface with this, like every policy that we fight for is rooted in some evidence that shows that it works, right? Like we're not just doing these things because we think it might work out. We're doing this because we've seen demonstrated evidence to show that they work and that they're effective. So I think there's nothing, again, leaving aside the Dickey Amendment, anyone who's got the will and the budget to allocate towards doing this sort of work, it can be done. I think it's obviously, resources are finite and we're dealing with a different epidemic, right? and have been for years. Like, there's a lot. Again, I think in this moment, I hope that as many resources as we can muster will be brought to bear to bring that kind of work forward.
Where to begin?
It is. I feel you, Dorothy. I must say, I've sighed those deep sighs many times over the last weeks and months. But I'll say this, and I apologize that I do have to jump off at 1 o'clock. But it's not insurmountable, right? It's a lot, and there are things that, as a matter of course, like, we can't do in the short term. I wish I could tell you that we could get a comprehensive background check bill through Congress and close the boyfriend and Charleston loopholes and repeal PLACA and T-Hart and the Dickey Amendment. Like, those things aren't going to happen. We can make progress, but I do think there's a ton of good work being done that can be done at the states. There's a ton of work that is happening at the community level. There's a ton of work that can be done just in terms of raising awareness. I think that this tragic cycle of, you have horrors like Uvalde or Buffalo or anything else, and people are sort of shaken to their core, and it for a second you think this has to be the one, right? This has to be the one that everyone suddenly realizes, like, we can stop this. And then time passes, and either people, because you can't live like that, constantly dwelling in that place, but it feels now, and I've been doing this now for almost 6 years, and as a prosecutor for a long time before that, and thinking about this kind of crime, like, just the work of keeping people in that moment, right? Don't look away, right? Don't forget about this. Don't let it become another headline. Like, keep it here. Like, keep the focus, keep the urgency. That's part of the work too, and just building that kind of communication and that kind of consensus and communities and understanding of whatever the political divides are and whatever your bottom lines are on a host of specific policies, that, like, committing to doing better on this, right? And I think that work is happening. It's going to keep happening at the states, and hopefully we'll see, maybe this week or next, even federally, whatever they can get done. And I hope it's a lot, but little by little, I think we can make change, and we've been making change, and I think it's gonna help save a lot of lives.
Okay, thank you for that.
All right, and with that, thank you so much, Liz and Lenore and Michelle and everybody. Thank you all for the time and being here. It's really a pleasure to join you, and I appreciate it.